For the past 3 months, I have been pretending that my mind was rotting away, watching my own children treat me like a piece of furniture they couldn't wait to throw out. It started as a small test after I forgot where I put my car keys once, and the look of greedy hope in my son's eyes made my blood run cold. I decided to lean into it, playing the part of a confused, fading old man, just to see who they really were when they thought I wasn't looking. Yesterday, the mask almost slipped when I heard my son Mark whispering to his sister in the kitchen while I sat 10 feet away in my armchair. He said, "Sell the old man's watch collection tomorrow. He won't need those Rolexes in the state-funded asylum anyway, and we need the cash for that villa in Tuscany." That was the moment I realized I wasn't a father to them anymore. I was just an ATM with a heartbeat that was taking too long to stop. Being 65 doesn't mean I am stupid. It just means I have had more time to learn how to build a trap. I sat there, staring at a blank television screen, letting a little bit of drool hang from my lip, while my daughter Sarah reached right past me to grab a crystal vase that belonged to my late wife. She didn't even look at me. She just checked the bottom for the manufacturer's mark and muttered about how much she could get for it on eBay. They were stripping my life bare while I was still breathing, treating my home like a crime scene before the body was even cold. The betrayal didn't stop with my children. My supposed best friend, Mike, a man I have known for 40 years, was right there with them. I watched through the hidden security cameras I installed years ago as he showed Mark how to bypass the digital lock on my floor safe. Mike knew that safe held the jewelry I promised to my granddaughters, but he didn't care. He told my son that I was too far gone to remember what was inside, so it wouldn't be stealing if the owner didn't know it existed. They were vultures, circling a man they thought was already dead. They didn't realize that every word they said was being recorded, and every item they moved was a nail in the coffin of their inheritance. I am an architect by trade, and I have spent my career designing structures that last. Now, I am designing a downfall for the people I once loved most, and it is going to be the most precise work of my life. The following week was a slow-motion car crash of disrespect. My son, Mark, and my daughter, Sarah, started showing up at my house almost every day, but they never brought groceries or asked how I was feeling. Instead, they brought clipboards and measuring tapes. They would walk right through the living room while I was sitting there, talking about me in the third person, as if I were a ghost haunting my own hallways. It was surreal and heartbreaking. I watched Sarah point at the heavy oak dining table where we used to have Christmas dinners, and tell Mark that it was too bulky to ship, so they should just list it on Facebook Marketplace for a quick grand. She didn't even bother to lower her voice. One afternoon, I sat in my favorite leather wingback chair, pretending to doze off. I kept my eyes closed just enough to see through the lashes. Mark walked up to me and actually waved a hand in front of my face to see if I was awake. When I didn't react, he let out a heavy sigh of annoyance. He reached down and patted my pockets, looking for my wallet. He found it, pulled out $200 in cash, and stuffed it into his own pocket without a second thought. He told Sarah that I didn't need walking around money anymore, since I couldn't even remember the way to the park. It felt like a physical blow to the chest, but I kept my breathing steady. I had to remain a silent observer if I wanted the full picture of their greed. The worst part was seeing how they treated my late wife's memory. Martha had a small collection of hand-painted ceramic birds that she cherished. They were worthless to a collector, but they meant the world to her. I caught Sarah throwing them into a cardboard box labeled junk. She wasn't even wrapping them in paper. She was just tossing them in, letting them clink and shatter against each other. To her, they were just clutter taking up space in a house she already considered hers. I had to dig my fingernails into my palms to keep from screaming at her to stop. I realized then that their greed wasn't just about money. It was a complete lack of empathy. They weren't just waiting for me to die. They were actively erasing the fact that I had ever existed. By the third week, they stopped being cautious altogether. I had placed a baby monitor, the kind with a sensitive microphone, behind a stack of old National Geographic magazines in the guest house where I spent most of my afternoons. They thought I was napping, lost in some fog of the mind, but I was as sharp as a razor, listening to every word through the receiver in my hand. The static hissed, and then I heard the familiar, cold voice of my son. He was talking to Sarah and Mike about their upcoming trip. Mark said they should book the premium suite in Tuscany, because once the house sale went through, they would be swimming in more cash than they knew how to spend. What came next made my stomach churn. Mike, my so-called best friend, laughed and said he had already contacted a specialized jeweler for my watch collection. He told my kids that since the watches were inherited and I was officially losing my grip on reality, they could sell them off the books to avoid taxes. They weren't just planning to take my money. They were planning to break the law to get even more of it. They talked about me like I was a burden, a heavy stone they were tied to, and they couldn't wait to cut the rope. Sarah complained that I was taking too long to decline and wondered out loud if there was a way to speed up the process of getting me into a facility. I sat in the dark guest house, the glow of the monitor lighting up my face, feeling a strange mix of grief and cold, hard clarity. They were discussing the price of my soul over glasses of my expensive scotch. Mark even joked that the state-run nursing home he found had decent reviews, even if it smelled like bleach and sadness. He said it was good enough for someone who wouldn't remember where he was anyway. Hearing my own flesh and blood plan to dump me in a warehouse for the elderly, just so they could live a life of luxury in Italy, changed something inside me. The father who wanted to forgive them died in that moment. The architect took over, and I began to plan a structure for their total ruin. The following morning, I walked into the main house and saw something that felt like a dagger to my heart. My daughter, Sarah, was standing in the hallway with a roll of brightly colored stickers in her hand. She was placing neon red circles on the frames of our family photos. I watched from the shadows as she reached for a large portrait of my late wife, Martha. It was the one taken on our 30th anniversary. Martha was laughing, her eyes full of life. Sarah didn't even pause. She slapped a red sticker right over Martha's face. On her clipboard, the red category was labeled as discard or donate. I felt a surge of heat rise up my neck. That photo was my most prized possession, and to Sarah, it was just a piece of old wood and glass that wouldn't fit her modern aesthetic. She moved to the piano next, the one she had learned to play on as a child. A yellow sticker went on that. Yellow meant sell at auction. She was marking the territory of my grief like it was a liquidation sale. She looked at me for a split second, and I quickly wiped the expression from my face, letting my jaw slacken and my eyes go vacant. She just sighed and told me to go sit on the porch because I was in the way of her progress. Later that evening, I found Mark in my home office. He was going through my desk drawers with a level of aggression that shocked me. He was tossing old letters and mementos onto the floor, looking for bank statements or property deeds. He found a small box that contained Martha's wedding ring. I saw him hold it up to the light, squinting at the diamond. He didn't look at it with love or memory. He looked at it like a pawn shop owner. He slipped it into his pocket and kept searching. I realized then that there was no bottom to their greed. They were stripping away every trace of the life I had built with their mother. I went back to my room and locked the door. I took out a clean sheet of paper. It was time to stop watching and start building their cage. The next day, I drove to the city under the cover of a routine doctor visit. Instead of the clinic, I pulled up to a glass office building to meet my attorney, Arthur. He had been my lawyer for 30 years and was the only person who knew I was as sane as a judge. When I sat down in his office, I didn't look like a confused old man anymore. I straightened my tie, looked him in the eye, and told him we were going to rewrite my legacy. I explained everything: the stickers on the photos, the stolen cash, the secret plans for the asylum, and the betrayal by Mike. Arthur looked horrified, but he listened as I laid out my architectural masterpiece of a plan. I told Arthur that I wanted to create a document that looked exactly like a full transfer of assets. To anyone skimming it, it would seem like I was handing over the keys to the kingdom because of my declining health. But buried deep in the fine print were clauses that acted like landmines. I moved every significant cent into a private charitable trust that would only activate upon the signing of this new document. I also included a clause stating that any person who had taken property from the house without written consent in the last 90 days would be legally liable for the full replacement value plus interest, enforceable immediately upon my signature. Arthur spent 3 hours drafting the papers while I sat by the window, watching the rain. I felt a strange sense of peace. I was no longer the victim of their greed. I was the architect of their education. I made sure there were specific sections for Mark, Sarah, and Mike. Each one was tailored to their specific sins. I wasn't just protecting my money. I was protecting the dignity of my life and Martha's memory. When I signed the preliminary drafts, my hand didn't shake. I told Arthur to prepare for a family dinner at my house in 3 days. I told him to bring the final documents and a notary. The stage was set, and the actors had no idea the script had been changed. The night before the big dinner was one of the strangest experiences of my life. I stayed in the guest house, watching the main house through the security feed on my tablet. Mark and Sarah had invited Mike over, and they were celebrating. They had broken into my vintage wine cellar and were drinking a bottle of Bordeaux that I had been saving for my 70th birthday. They weren't even using proper glasses. They were laughing, clinking their cups, and toasted to the end of an era. It was sickening to watch them celebrate my mental demise like it was a lottery win. Mark was already on his laptop, showing Sarah pictures of luxury villas in Italy. He was talking about how they would split the proceeds from the estate sale. They had a spreadsheet open, listing my cars, my furniture, and even the tools in my workshop. They were calculating their new lives down to the last cent. Mike was leaning back in my favorite chair, feet up on the coffee table, bragging about how the jeweler was ready to take the watches the moment the papers were signed. They were so blinded by their own reflected glory that they didn't notice the tiny red light of the camera lens watching them from the bookshelf. At one point, Sarah got a bit sentimental, but not for me. She mentioned that she would miss the house because it was a good neighborhood for her social status. But Mark quickly reminded her that the property taxes were too high and that the cash would be much more useful for their investments. They didn't have a single conversation about my well-being or where I would actually go once they cleared me out. They had already erased me from their future. I turned off the screen and sat in the dark, listening to the crickets. I felt a cold, hard resolve. I wasn't just doing this for revenge. I was doing it to see if there was a single shred of humanity left in them. I knew the answer, but the dinner would be the final proof. The night of the dinner arrived, and the air in the dining room was thick with hypocrisy. My children had gone all out, ordering expensive catering and setting the table with the fine china they had already marked for sale. Mark and Sarah were acting like the most devoted children in the world. Sarah kept leaning over to pat my hand, telling me how much she loved me, while Mark poured me a glass of water with a look of fake concern that made my skin crawl. Mike sat at the end of the table, acting like the loyal family friend, nodding along to every lie. It was a performance worthy of an award, and I played my part perfectly. staring blankly at my plate and nodding like a man who barely knew where he was. During the main course, Mark stood up and cleared his throat. He started a speech about how difficult the last few months had been for the family. He spoke about my health and how they only wanted what was best for me, a place where I could get professional care and be safe. He talked about legacy and responsibility, while Mike smiled in the background. It was nauseating. They were treating me like a child, or worse, a problem that finally had a solution. Sarah even squeezed out a few fake tears, saying how hard it would be to see me leave the family home, while I knew she had already scheduled the movers for Monday morning. Then came the toasts. They raised their glasses of my expensive wine to my health and my future. They were actually celebrating the fact that they thought they had won. They were so confident that the old man was broken and defeated. I looked around the table at their smiling faces, and for a second, I felt a deep, piercing sadness. These were the people I had raised, the people I had worked 40 years to provide for. And here they were, toasted to my exile. I let out a long, shaky breath and looked at the door. Right on cue, the doorbell rang. It was Arthur, my attorney, carrying a thick leather briefcase. The vultures leaned in, their eyes widening at the sight of the documents. The trap was open, and they were stepping right inside. Arthur entered the room with a professional nod, placing his briefcase on the table next to the half-eaten dinner. The room went silent, but it wasn't a respectful silence. It was the silence of predators watching their prey finally fall. Mark and Sarah practically pushed their chairs back to make room for him. Mark leaned over and whispered to me that it was okay, that I just needed to sign some papers to make sure I was taken care of forever. He even placed a pen in my hand, his fingers trembling slightly with excitement. I looked at the pen, then at the documents, letting my hand shake just enough to make them lean in closer. Arthur began to read the formal headers of the documents. He mentioned the transfer of the estate, the management of the bank accounts, and the power of attorney. I saw Mike lean back, a smug grin on his face, probably already calculating his commission from the watch sale. Sarah was nodding aggressively, her eyes fixed on the signature line. They were so hungry for the finish line that they didn't even notice that Arthur was skipping the sections that contained the specific legal definitions of the trust. They just wanted the ink on the paper. I felt the weight of their greed pressing down on me, a physical force in the room. I hovered the pen over the paper for a long moment. Mark urged me on, telling me it was for my own good and that everything would be easier once this was done. I looked up at him, my eyes still playing the part of the confused old man, and asked if Martha would be happy about this. Sarah let out a frustrated huff and said that Mom would want me to be safe. It was the ultimate lie, using the memory of their mother to steal from their father. That was the final spark I needed. I pressed the pen to the paper and signed my name with a firm, steady hand that had nothing to do with a man who was losing his mind. As the notary stamped the pages, the atmosphere in the room changed instantly. The kids started laughing, and Mark actually reached out to grab the papers before the ink was even dry. They thought the game was over. They had no idea that I had just signed the warrant for their financial destruction. As soon as the last page was stamped, the room erupted into a chilling display of triumph. Mark snatched the document from the table and pumped his fist in the air, while Sarah pulled out her phone to call a real estate agent right then and there. Mike stood up and clapped Mark on the back, telling him he was finally a free man. They didn't even look at me. I was just a ghost in the chair again. But then I cleared my throat. It wasn't the weak, shaky sound they were used to. It was a sharp, commanding noise that cut through their celebration like a blade. I sat up straight, my eyes clearing and focusing on my son with a cold intensity that froze him where he stood. I told them to sit down. The room went deathly quiet. I looked at Mark and told him that since he was so worried about my memory, I thought I should show him a few things I hadn't forgotten. I pulled a remote from my pocket and pressed a button. The large television on the wall flickered to life, showing the hidden camera footage of them drinking my wine, stealing Martha's ring, and laughing about dumping me in a state-funded asylum. I played the audio from the baby monitor, where they discussed the illegal sale of my watches. Their faces turned a sickly shade of gray. Sarah tried to stammer an excuse, but I silenced her with a look. I told her that she was right about one thing. Mom would be ashamed, but only of her. Arthur then took a second set of documents from his briefcase and began to read the real terms they had just signed. Since I had proven their intent to defraud a vulnerable person, the trust I created had immediately locked all my assets away from them forever. Furthermore, the clause they signed obligated them to pay back every cent they had stolen or moved within 48 hours, or I would hand the video evidence to the police for elder abuse and grand theft. Mike's smug grin vanished when I mentioned the recordings of his jeweler friend. I told them that the house was now owned by a foundation for elderly victims of family greed, and they had exactly 1 hour to pack their things and leave. The screams and pleas started, but for the first time in months, I felt truly at peace. I wasn't a victim. I was the architect of my own freedom, and I had just demolished their house of cards. Watching them scramble to pack their bags was the most honest moment I had seen from my family in years. There were no more fake smiles or pretend concerns. Mark was shouting about how unfair it was, and Sarah was sobbing, begging me to reconsider, while clutching a designer handbag she had bought with my money. I didn't say a word. I just stood on the porch and watched as they loaded their cars. When Mike tried to shake my hand and apologize, I simply pointed to the driveway. I had already sent the recordings of his jeweler friend to the local authorities. He left faster than a man half his age. By midnight, the house was silent for the first time in months. I walked through the rooms, peeling off every neon sticker Sarah had placed. I took the portrait of Martha and put it back in its place of honor in the hallway. I sat down in my favorite chair, poured myself a glass of the Bordeaux they hadn't finished, and felt the weight of the world lift off my shoulders. I wasn't alone. I was finally free. I had lost a son and a daughter that night, but the truth is, I had lost them a long time ago. At least now, I didn't have to live in their shadows. Today, I am living a life I never thought possible at 65. I sold the big house and used the funds to start a foundation that provides legal aid for seniors facing financial abuse. I travel, I paint, and I have made real friends who don't care about the size of my bank account. My children try to call occasionally when they are short on rent, but I changed my number. Sometimes, the best way to love someone is to let them face the consequences of their own actions. I am finally developing into the man Martha always knew I could be. Looking back at everything, I have to ask you, do you think I was too harsh on my own blood? Or did I do the right thing by teaching them a lesson they will never forget? What would you have done if you found your family marking your belongings for sale while you were still in the room? If you enjoyed this story of justice and a fresh start, please hit the like button and leave a comment with your thoughts. Your support helps us bring more stories like this to life. Don't forget to subscribe so you never miss a new upload. The end. Thank you for listening.